Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Really excited today to share some data results as well as some actionable insights on retention. So my name, Jared Brickman. I'm the Senior Vice President of Research here at Carnegie. I'm going to be focusing on the first half of this presentation about some results from some research we did in the world of retention. I'm then going to pass it over to my colleague Courtney, who is our Assistant Director of Student Success Implementations here. She's going to show you how to do all the amazing things in Slate that are going to take this from just a conceptual theory to something that you can actually do, which is really cool and why I love to do research for folks who can take it one step further. So let's dive right in and start with this basic understanding of our agenda. As I mentioned, I'll talk about our research. We'll talk about predicting retention through that research, and then get into the Slate integration itself. So our baseline here, our baseline is an understanding of what is retention. And I'm sure everyone here knows what retention refers to, but we like to think about it in this way of mitigating dropout or transfer and understanding what are some of the ways that we can be proactive in this kind of scenario so that we're not thinking of retention as a, well, this already happened situation, but rather something that we can really jump into very early in the student journey. And so on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about our research that we did in the world of retention. It was really important for us to consider what the college landscape looked like after the pandemic. Retention has obviously been an issue far before COVID-19 ever happened, but we knew that after the pandemic, and I say kind of after in quotes, there are still things going on, but we knew that in the way the higher education world has changed, there are definitely going to be things that we need to understand in the retention world that are important. So as a result, we did run a survey with more than 1,200 students in a fall semester. This survey covered all levels of class in an undergraduate situation, so first years through seniors. We used our College Express service to create that sample and find those folks who are currently at institutions around the country. And really importantly, this was open to several different institutional types. So your big publics, your small privates, we had lots of different students answering these questions. And what we found is more than half have considered dropping out. But this isn't time to panic. That statistic is a little scary, but it's not the end all. So let's talk a little bit about some of these results. The first thing I'll mention is that 50+% is a little bit less scary when you find that 77% of students say they plan on completing their degree at their current institution. They're basically certain that that's going to happen. Now, that doesn't mean they haven't thought about dropping out or thought about transferring. That's what the 55% in the dropout side are talking about there. But really, we tend to find that most students want to persist, but there are problems that get in the way of persistence. And that's what we wanted to look at in a statistical model we were creating. So we looked at retention behavior, so the intent to drop out or the intent to transfer, and we looked at a lot of different predictive factors. What are some of the demographics, some of the personality factors, some of the kind of opinions of people that might lead them to thinking about dropping out or transferring. And some of the results are what we're going to be focused in on today. Now, we're going to be putting out a much larger report about all of this retention information. For today, I really just want to focus in on three main concepts: belonging, confidence, and barriers. But what's really important to note is institutional degree and satisfaction was one of the strongest predictors of retention. And that is no surprise because those are the historical factors or predictors that have always led toward that decision of, well, if they're happy with their school, they're probably going to stay there. If they're happy with their degree, they're probably going to stay there. It's not really surprising to anyone, but we need to make sure that those classic or historical predictors were in our model to understand if other things like belongingness and confidence really made an influence on retention decisions. And institutional satisfaction is something that you usually can't measure until it's kind of too late. So let's start to look at things that we could measure maybe a bit earlier and maybe aren't always at the top of mind when we're thinking of retention, starting with the idea of belongingness. So, what you're going to see on the following pages are actual questions that we asked in a survey. We asked how much the students in the survey agreed with these particular statements. And what we did afterward was it's called a factor analysis to determine whether or not these statements load onto a considerable variable, an overall variable called belongingness. This idea that a person says, I belong here. In fact, there's even a question, I feel like I belong here, or that statement. But that doesn't really capture the entirety of the variable. So you can see there are other things that lead us toward that feeling of belongingness, feeling safe at school, feeling that the school's ethics align with their own, having school spirit. All of this can contribute to an overall feeling of belongingness. And what our results found is that belongingness is highly correlated, highly predictive of retention. As we continue to think about how do we create communities that students want to be in, that students feel comfortable in, belongingness really is that factor that speaks to whether or not people say, this is a place for me. In the prospective student audience world, you actually get this coming from a term called campus feel. Have you ever heard that? Prospective students will say, oh, the campus just felt right. Well, that turns into belongingness once they become students. So it's a really key factor in the retention puzzle. The next factor is what we have called confidence. I actually come from a background in health communication. And in health communication, we have a concept called self-efficacy, which is basically the same thing of confidence. It basically says that if we're going to take some healthy behavior or tackle some difficult challenge like completing a degree, we have to believe in ourselves that we can do it. If I don't think I can run a marathon, I'm not going to put on my running shoes and try to run a marathon because I just don't have any self-efficacy for that. And it's true, I'm probably never running a marathon in my life, and that's okay. But with the degree completion side of things, we need people to say, I feel confident that I'm going to be able to complete this degree. When that confidence wanes, people start to think, am I a failure? Can I not do this? This has actually been really related to a lot of the traditional goalposts that people use to understand retention in their data, because they see people's grades, they see people's attendance, and they say grades are low, attendance is bad, this person is a retention risk. Well, the reason those people are a retention risk, beyond just the fact that they're not doing well, is that it usually leads into lower confidence, lower self-efficacy for the person to say, yes, I can do this. And so as you can see some of these measures here, just feeling as though they can manage their course load, and even that they have the skills, the intelligence to complete their degree. Building people up, building that confidence is critical to the retention puzzle and was a strong predictor in our model. The last factor I'm going to talk about today are called barriers. And in this case, barriers are what we call in the research a reverse coded variable. In other words, before we were saying you want more belongingness, you want more confidence. And now with barriers, we're definitely saying you want fewer barriers, which is probably an obvious outcome if you're thinking about it, but I just like to mention it so that when people say barriers is a predictor, predictors can be positive or negative predictors. So when people say my mental health is feeling too low, I feel isolated, or I worry I can't finish your degree, they're concerned about their physical health, the cost of getting to their degree. These are barriers or hurdles that people have to jump. And the larger these barriers are, the more likely people are to stop. This is really typical behavioral analysis in understanding behavior. So I don't think it's a surprise to anyone that barriers are a big part of the retention puzzle, but sometimes it's hard for us to recognize what barriers might exist for a person. It's not so easy as just thinking, well, this person is low income, so they're going to be worried about cost. There are people who are going to be high income that are going to be worried about cost. There will be people who are low income who aren't worried about it for a number of reasons. And so understanding a person's personal barriers are really important in understanding why it is they think they can't really succeed. And as I saw there, you can definitely see the immediate interplay between these three variables. Are barriers creating the lack of confidence? Can they also be a cause for that lower feeling of belongingness? These are definitely variables that are going to have interplay. So these are the three interesting variables that we found kind of that went in addition to institutional satisfaction and degree satisfaction in our overall path model for understanding retention. I won't spend a lot of time here. We're not here to understand path models. Courtney's going to be here to talk about how you operationalize this. But what it's really saying is that on the far left, what you're seeing are demographic indicators or factors that predict some of these things that we just talked about. For example, the LGBTQIA and disabled audiences in our respective survey felt less belongingness at their institutions. This is not to say those groups could never feel belonging in those institutions, but rather, generally speaking, they feel less belonging. As a result, because they feel less belonging, they are at a greater risk of retention because you can see the positive relationship between belongingness and retention and the negative relationship between their personal status and belongingness. So that's how you tend to read this path model. And as I mentioned before, there's going to be a report that Carnegie puts out that has a lot more depth and information about how to read this model, how to use this model. But for today, I just wanted it to create a baseline of understanding of when we're thinking about retention, this is what Carnegie means when we talk retention. And these are some of the factors that can contribute to students who don't persist. Kind of a major takeaway then is that really students do want to persist. There are a lot of students with positive experiences, but because of the things like barriers or because belongingness can wane, retention problems still remain. And so we want to be trying to remove as many of these historical and problematic variables or barriers in higher education while also creating this sense of community, this sense of belongingness, and also letting people know that they have the skills and abilities to do things. Obviously, all of this is, kind of pie in the sky great, of course, and none of this is going to shock you. If I went and told you, hey, if a person feels like they belong at your school, they're going to retain better. Well, of course, but this kind of research is really helpful in understanding the why, and it sets you up to ask really good questions to predict it in the future, which is why now you might ask, what do we do with this? And that's why I have Courtney here. So I'm going to pass the presentation over to her so she can explain how we can use this information in Slate.
Yes, thank you, Jared. That was incredibly helpful. And I'm so excited to take it away from here and tell y'all how to put all of that into Slate and to create helpful things for y'all to digest this retention information and make it actionable within your institutions. So first, let me give a brief overview of Slate for Student Success. Slate for Student Success is broadly defined as the point in which the student is enrolled until the time in which they graduate. And so anything that the student does in that time is all the bread and butter of Slate for Student Success. If you are familiar with Slate for Admissions, then you are already familiar with Slate for Student Success. It uses all of the same tools, all of the same modules. It is the exact same platform. We just use it a little differently and under the scope of current students. Because of that, we know that Slate is inherently built of forms and queries. So we're going to be highlighting those two features pretty heavily in the webinar today. One thing to mention about student success is you already know who your students are with student success, right? Differences between admissions and student success is we're not creating new person records using RFI forms or for events. We know who all of your students are. So all of that data is going to be imported from an SIS, from to LISMA, from Banner, from wherever all of your current student information exists, which also means we have access to all of the other information and all of the other data that exists in those other systems to help paint a picture of all of the things that your students are doing. So let's dig into what this means in Slate and how we can select the information that Jared was just mentioning and put that into Slate. We can do so using forms. If you've seen Slate before, you've probably used a form. So this is an example of what a check-in survey can look like. A lot of these questions are questions that you've likely seen before because we just saw them on Jared's slides of feelings of belongingness and confidence are highlighted here. We are using a Likert scale that collects those information of how strongly a student agrees with these certain variables or with these data points. One thing to mention here is that these fields are actually mapped to an entity. Entities in Slate are custom data tables in which you can collect one-to-many relationships. Slate for student success. All we do basically is create entities. And we'll show you what that looks like on the student side. But each of these fields is mapped to a retention entity, meaning every time that the student fills out this form, it creates a new entity row, which allows you to report on this information year over year, form submission over form submission, meaning that when the student submits this form after their fall term freshman year, and then they submit it again their senior year, you can see how different the responses are. Putting it within an entity allows for that versus just having it as a form submission or as person scope fields. And so having a retention entity and having these fields scoped to that entity allows for that reporting. Also on this slide, we have a translation code, which I'll show you how to use in just a second. But this translation code takes the responses from the survey and assigns a numeric value to each of the responses, which we'll use to create totals for these different scores. We'll add them all up, and then we can use that to have different types of action items associated with total scores of belonging, barriers, and confidence. So what does this look like on a student record? Let's take a look at Dylan. This is what a retention, or this is what an entity looks like on a student record. It's a custom tab. And we have this broken out by those three different pillars, so to say, right? We have your confidence, belonging, and barriers. And when I look at this, I can see something that stands out pretty strong right now. The total barrier score. Dylan has a near perfect score for barriers. The most score, the highest score that you can get is 200 because strongly agree is assigned to 50 based on that translation table that we were looking at. So Dylan is facing a lot of barriers right now. We can see that they somewhat agree with cost concerns, meaning that they have concerns about affording the rest of their time at the institution. They're feeling pretty isolated, which is impacting their ability to perform academically. That mental health isolation is impacting their ability to participate in coursework and academics, as they somewhat agree with that question. And then these outside factors is alluding to what is happening outside of the classroom that's impacting his ability to perform well. This could be family, this could be roommates, this could be any number of things that is impacting the student Dylan's ability to perform academically. Having the survey allows the students to tell you how they're feeling. And this is really important. Giving the students the ability to tell you how they are feeling in these different areas is especially important because on the flip side, we can see Monty is telling a pretty different story based on their form responses. We can see Monty is neutral about cost concerns. They somewhat disagree with their health isolation. They somewhat disagree with the mental or physical barriers, and they somewhat disagree with the outside factors. So their total barrier score is 90. The lowest score that you can get is 40. So 90 is a pretty low score and pretty average for what we were seeing. And so Monty's feeling pretty good compared to what Dylan's feeling in the sense of barriers. We can also see that Monty has a pretty high belonging score. They agree with quite a few things here. And so this data paints a pretty strong picture of how the student is feeling based on these form responses. As a student fills out the form multiple times, this is a question of when do you want the students to submit these forms, right? That's one of the hardest part in social studies in general is getting form responses. And so Um, do we put holds on students' accounts in order for them to submit? Incentivizing it is something to think about as we build out these forms. But just throwing that out there of just because we have a form response is great and we can use that data, but no form response is also a pretty good form response as well. And so if somebody, and I'll show that in just a second, but if somebody doesn't have any responses on this retention survey result, that is also a pretty telling story as well. Let's see how these translation tables work. So translation codes in action. This is what the translation table is doing in the background. So translation tables allows you to transform data from one thing into another. And so what our translation table is doing is taking a string value of strongly agree, strongly disagree, neutral, etc., all of those different values for a Likert scale, and assigning a numeric value to it. This is on the back end of our widget form that we just saw. And what it's doing is it's taking that value, translating it through, assigning that number, and then in that blue box of total score for belonging, we are summing all of those values together. And so in the calculation formula box, you can see we're taking the export codes from each one of our scores for different questions, and we're summing them together to determine what our total belonging score is. And when we click into each of our form responses here, we can see what each of those scores are, so we can even get a better picture on the actual form itself, and we can see the total score of belonging. This is helpful just to see at a glance as you're looking through, seeing where it is. Some people like to see the Likert scale, strongly agree, strongly disagree. Other people like to see the numeric values, and so having them both here on the retention entity display is helpful for all folks to view and to witness. But this isn't the only data that we can collect in Slate. Like I mentioned earlier, student success is all inherently imported data from other systems, right? It's from the SIS, it's from your LMS, it is from your card swiping system, it is from so many different places that you have access to data to. So long as you create a home for it in Slate, you can use it in Slate. And I say this with a caveat of start small and then we can get bigger. This is just an example of all of the different things that are possible to do. And so some examples of helpful data that you can bring in to, again, paint a good picture of what the student is doing to help design these retention actionable efforts are things like extracurricular activities. What's the student up to? Do they have an on-campus job? Are they involved in extramural sports? Are they participating in Greek life? Do they hold a position? All of this is information that exists somewhere. And if we have access to that and we can import it into Slate, then we can use it in Slate. Things like cumulative GPA, class attendance holds are also really helpful to have in Slate. Something that we built out quite often in our student success implementation is a hold process. Flags, the same thing, a meeting with advisor. All of these are data points that paint a picture on how the student is doing and what they are up to while they are enrolled in your institution. So what do we do once we have all of this data in Slate? Great, we have it here. What do we do with it? We can make query libraries. Query libraries, if you've never used one before, highly, highly recommend it. Query libraries are within the query tool or the query module, and it is a way for you to create templated exports and filters that can be used anywhere that exports and filters are available. So in this example, we have a handful of different retention-related filters where we are looking at different retention-related data. So if we take a look at the first one, students who have not attended an advising appointment in 90 days. You can see in the subquery, we're joining to our individual academic advising appointments. That's a scheduler event template. And we're looking for a form submission date of 30 or 90 days prior to today. So have they attended an academic advising appointment and the aggregate does not exist? So we're identifying students who have not attended an advising appointment. Next example is to look at cumulative GPAs between a specified range. This one we're looking at between 2.5 and 3.49. You can also see in our example that we also have above 3.5 and below 2.5. So we have the whole 4-point scale covered in this query library here. But again, utilizing those different operators to get at the data that is most helpful for you to identify students who might need specified outreach. And this one is my personal favorite. This one we're stacking different filters based on different entities. And so here we're looking for students who are currently enrolled with a faculty concern. Faculty concern is a flag that has been raised on the student record. So that is another entity. So these are two entities. We have our class schedule entity where we're importing the student schedule, and we're looking for any of those class schedule entities with the status of enrolled. And then we're also looking for the existence of a flag that is faculty concern. What this is saying is that we have a current student who a faculty member is concerned about them for whatever reason. We should probably know about that. And so that is what this filter is doing. Wherever we place this filter, we'll identify those specific students. So what can we do with all of these query libraries? Now that we have the data, we have a way to organize it. Now y'all get to plug and play with all of these different filters in a handful of different ways. I want to outline two specifically. The first one is population rule building for automated messages. Everyone in higher ed, y'all wear so many different hats. So let's automate certain things where we can. Let's take one thing off your plate. Let's make the plate a little bit lighter. And so let's build out drip marketing campaigns. Let's build out responsive mailings that you can set it and forget it, meaning when a student hits a specified population and they meet that filter criteria, they get an email, they get a text message, they get some kind of outreach that you don't manually have to do. That's what these populations and these drip marketing campaigns can do. So what I have here in this filter is I'm looking for students who have a cumulative GPA between 2.5 and 3.49. I have a filter of previously involved in extracurriculars, meaning that they used to have somebody who would ask them on a regular basis, how are you doing today? When you're involved in extracurriculars, that means that you have someone checking in on you on a somewhat frequent basis. These students who meet this filter criteria likely mean that they don't have that resource anymore. And then the last one is they have a low belonging score. And so their belonging score is fairly low. What does this mean to me? This means that these students likely need to get involved, or they were involved and are no longer involved. Maybe they want to get involved again. And so the population that I created was clubs and organizations. This clubs and organizations population has a drip marketing campaign where a message is sent out once a month to say, hey, go check out our website for our clubs and organizations. Check out the upcoming club fair. Any kind of notification type of email, any kind of those types of messaging that just lets the student know that you're thinking about them and giving them the proper resources. An additional example is tutoring services. So we're looking for students who have an extracurricular. They have attended an advising session in the last 90 days. They have not attended a tutoring session in the last 90 days. They have a low GPA, but their confidence score is high. So what this combination of filters is telling me is that somebody's checking in on them consistently because they're in an extracurricular. They've checked in with their academic advisor. So they've taken the steps necessary for their academic advising team. They have attended a tutoring session, which is a-okay. Not everybody does that. But their GPA is low, but their confidence score is high. So they're still feeling very confident that they will be able to complete their degree. They're feeling pretty good. They're just struggling with their courses. They just have a class that they are not participating well in. They are not feeling very good. Let's keep that confidence score high. Tying back to what Jared was saying earlier, sometimes it's a twofold of low GPA can sometimes be because their confidence score is low and so on and so forth. So let's make sure that the confidence score stays high and help get that GPA up by putting them in a population of tutoring services. Let's get them connected with a proper tutor so that they can help identify where they need to be, where they need help so that they can raise that GPA. Taking one thing off your plate and automating these messages for these students. Another action item that y'all can create is a to-do list for advisors on the homepage. So just like we made that query library, you can take any number of those filters and the corresponding exports and put them in user-specific queries for to-do lists. This can be the advisor's first step every single day. They come to their to-do list, they check these queries, who needs to sign up for an academic advising appointment. And the filter here could really just be students who haven't attended an advising appointment in 90 days. Maybe that's a requirement for your institution of everybody needs to attend an advising appointment every 3 months, every term, every quarter, you name the time frame. And that could be a to-do list, and that can be a query scope to them if y'all are using staff assignments. Also, just throwing it out there, you can have as many staff assigned fields as you want plugging to your user base. You can use the current user filter, so you're only pulling in your own students who are assigned to you. That could be a to-do list item. Students who have recently dropped a course, because you're importing all of your course data on a daily, sometimes multiple times a day, you'll know pretty immediately if a student has dropped a course. That sometimes requires pretty immediate outreach. Why did you drop a course? Are there other things that are going on that would cause you to drop a course? Just kind of a touch point. And if it's a known thing that everybody knew, the support team knew that they were going to drop a course, and it wouldn't be a surprise, should probably still populate in the query to trigger some kind of touch point. So on and so forth with the financial aid and registration holds. Those are especially important when it comes to ad drop or registering for classes. Let's make sure students can actually register for classes and those holds get lifted. That's a pretty good to-do list item. And then just kind of an ongoing one of students with a low score of belonging. Decisions that need to be made up to that are kind of up to you. What is the best method for that? Is it to reach out to them with your academic advisor? Is that to pair them with another student who also had a low score of belonging, but now has a high score of belonging? There are things that you can use within the system to help support these students. But utilizing a homepage to-do list is another way of utilizing those query libraries to create action items surrounding this data. So in conclusion, we covered a lot. We did a lot of different things today. When considering retention, remember that a student's feeling of belongingness, self-efficacy, and no major barriers will be more likely to persist. I'm not going to read all of it, but you can read the slide. In summary, students want to be here. They don't want to transfer. Transferring is hard. And so let's make it easy for them to provide feedback, to tell y'all how they're feeling and how they're doing. Collect that data into Slate in a meaningful way that you can then use to create curated outreach plans. Outreach can be either faculty, advisor, or student focused, depending on what lands best with your current students. And just start small. You don't have to do it all right now. Start with the data points that matter the most. Start with the resources that y'all have readily available. And then this is just the beginning. Maybe next year we'll do another webinar of, once you have all of this data, here's how to digest it all. Here's how to see the different trends. But let's just start small and get the data in there and create some action plans around it. But let students help students, let yourselves help students, and give students the avenue to share how they're feeling. Those are really the big conclusions. So thank you so much for participating. This has been very fun. My name's Courtney Muma. It's been a pleasure. And thank you to Jared for joining us as well. And we'll see y'all next time.